Hi, I'm Sarah Griscom, and I'm the Water Quality Lab Technician for the town of Chatham. Recently, I sat down with Bob Duncanson and Greg Berman, and we talked about the water quality program. It's very impressive. Stick around for the end. We're going to be looking at Dick Hosmer as he samples Cockle Cove, with Bob Duncanson explaining what's happening. Greg Berman, Dr. Bob Duncanson. So I'm going to start with you, Bob.
Okay.
You ready? Give us your historical perspective on the last 25 years of the water quality program. How was it decided to create the program in the first place for the water watchers?
We started the program for a couple of reasons. One, we'd been doing water quality work for many years, primarily focused on bacterial levels, because that was at the time that I started with the town and my predecessor before me, it was all driven by shellfish, and so that's bacterial levels. In the 1980s, the town was working on some wastewater issues, and we'd heard anecdotal evidence from quite a few people in town that the water quality just wasn't the same as it was when they'd first moved to Chatham. That things, you know, there weren't as much eelgrass, there weren't as much oysters and other shellfish, and, you know, that's all related to water quality. So we knew that we had an issue, or we suspected there was an issue. We didn't know what it was at the time, and there was no data. We had the bacteriological data for the shellfishing program, but we didn't have any general ecological data. So we sat down with some folks from UMass Dartmouth, and we created the Water Watchers program. Well, we actually created the Coastal Water Nutrient Monitoring Program. That's the official title of the program. And it was geared primarily toward nutrient levels, because the folks at UMass Dartmouth were working in other areas in the Cape, and they were seeing nutrients, primarily nitrogen, as being a major issue. And so we suspected that we probably had the same problem that other communities in the Cape did. So that's what really created the program, was to start to gather some data so we could make some intelligent decisions, and we really knew what was going on, because we didn't know what was happening out there.
So to gather this data, it's a huge undertaking, and it's expensive. So thus the water watchers, the citizen volunteers. How unusual was it to have volunteers collecting data that would provide this important information for the town? What were your concerns about, you know?
It was very unusual at the time.
Yeah.
When we first talked about creating this type of program, we had some conversations with the state regulators, and they basically said, "No, you can't do it. You can't do it. I mean, you know, citizen data just isn't good enough for the state to even pay any attention to it and whatnot." We had a shellfish constable at the time who didn't like that response on the bacteria side. That's what created the water quality lab in the first place. Then on the nutrient side, when we started that program, we said, okay, state and EPA, what would it take to have this be good information, basically? And they, you know, sent us a whole booklet of information about that kind of program and whatnot. And we said, all right, if that's what we have to do, that's what we're going to do, because it was the kind of thing that there was no way the town could manage to do it, because, you know, we're talking 20, 30, 40 locations. We had, you know, I was basically running the water quality lab as a one-person operation, so I couldn't go out and do it all. We didn't have enough other town staff in shellfish or things to be able to help out. And if we hired consultants to do it, it was extraordinarily expensive.
Millions?
Hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
Probably not millions, maybe, but definitely hundreds of thousands for each summer. So we sat down with the state, and we worked up, and at the time we were also working with the Pleasant Bay Alliance to some extent. We sat down with them, we came up with what's known as a QAP, or Quality Assurance Project Plan, which is EPA's terminology for basically you lay everything out, you put it all on paper, everybody can review it, and then basically they sign off on it. And ultimately that's what happened. We developed a QAP that said, all right, this is how we're going to train our volunteers, this is the equipment they're going to use, this is when they're going to sample, this is how they're going to sample, this is how the lab's going to do the analyses of the samples. They had to put in all their procedures and processes as well into the QAP. We came up with the QAP, it went to DEP, it went to EPA, and both of them signed off on it. So
So
now,
this protocol was finally approved by
Yep.
them to allow citizens, non-scientists.
right, to do the work. And then
That's
we
great.
had, then we created the Water Watchers along with the Friends of Chatham Waterways. And we provided training for them, we provided the equipment, and they would go out and do the samples, collect field measurements, and also collect the water samples that ultimately then were sent to UMass Dartmouth for analysis.
That's quite impressive. That's great. So are there any water quality trends that you'd like to share right now with us? Because I know there's the issue of statistical analyses, and
Yeah.
how much do you want to say about a trend before, you know,
Yeah.
you really need to do the proper analysis?
You know, the program had a couple of goals when we set it up. One was to just see what conditions were, you know, were conditions good, bad, or indifferent? What were potential trends over time? And then to provide data to be used in various other studies like the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan and the Mass Estuaries Project. We now have 25 years worth of data, which is a good data set. With your help, we produce graphs of the data every year. And we look at three key things. We look at the eutrophication index, we look at the nitrogen levels, and we look at the chlorophyll or photosynthetic activity that takes place in the water. That's relatively simple. And so with a 25-year data set, you can kind of see how things go over time. The important thing is you can take out the variability that occurs. It's a natural system, so it occurs naturally. Some years are wet years, some years are dry years, some years are warm, cold, and that all changes how the water responds.
Each of those things impact the data.
Each of those things impacts the results that we get. You know, we do 5 samplings across the season now. We used to do May to October. Very hard to get volunteers in May and October and whatnot. So over the decades, working with UMass Dartmouth, we've narrowed it down to the July, August, and September period, which is when the water's warmest. You know, the situation that we're dealing with is just like your lawn. You put fertilizer on your lawn, it grows more. You know, it's warm in the summer, it grows more. And your lawns, you know, in the wintertime, it's dormant. Well, marine environment's the same thing. You know, the more fertilizer you put in from lawns, from septic systems, from road runoff, you know, that all ends up, even if you don't live on the water, you know, when we first started it, everybody thought it was, oh, it's the waterfront property owners. They have to clean things up. Well, we now know that that's not the case.
What is the case?
We now know that it's the entire watershed, which is the land area upon which a drop of water falls will ultimately arrive at a water body. It might be a lake, or it might be an estuary, or it might be the Atlantic Ocean, Nantucket Sound, but ultimately that water will get to some receiving water body. In the case of our estuaries, places like, you know, Taylor's Pond, the Stage Harbor Complex, they don't flush very well compared to Nantucket Sound or the Atlantic Ocean.
What do you mean by flushing?
Well, I was going to say, when that nutrient reaches there, it doesn't immediately leave.
Right.
You know, a molecule of nitrogen that gets into those water bodies may take weeks or months to get out to, say, Nantucket Sound or the Atlantic Ocean. And in the meantime, it's providing fertilizer to that area, and any plant in there will grow. And most of the plants that we're dealing with are microscopic. They're plankton. And if you get too much of that plankton, it shades the water, so some of the other aquatic plants like eelgrass will not grow. And then when all that plankton dies and falls to the bottom, which it does, it then decomposes, and what happens is it uses up the oxygen.
Right.
And then things like, you know, if you're a fish and the oxygen's low, all you have to do is move. But if you're a shellfish or something like that and the oxygen's too low, you can't get up and move. And so that's where we see the negative impacts.
So that's what you call eutrophication,
That's what we call eutrophication.
Of your ponds?
Yep.
Okay, so too much nitrogen.
Yep.
So here's a question. How long will it take before we start to see water quality improvements from both installing sewer lines and removal of these septic systems that are providing a lot of that nitrogen to our water bodies?
Yeah, that's
When are we going to see it?
That's one of the big issues that I think the public has difficulty grasping.
Yeah.
You know, they think, oh, okay, you're putting sewer down the street, there's going to be immediate improvement. Well, the problem is If you're a waterfront property owner, the improvement might be fairly quick because your source of the nitrogen, your lawn or your septic system, isn't that far removed from the water body. Groundwater on the Cape moves an average of 1 foot per day. So, you know, if your home's right on the water, it may take less than a year before clean water, if you remove that septic system, now you're putting clean water into the system basically, all right? That may go fairly quickly, within a year. But if you live up in middle Chatham somewhere, you know, beyond the time of travel, we generally talk about a 10-year time of travel. So UMass Dartmouth and USGS have drawn lines of 10-year time of travel to all these water bodies. And so, you know, if you're beyond that 10-year time of travel, it's going to take more than 10 years. You know, even if we sewer you tomorrow, the dirty water that's already there is going to take more than 10 years to get there, followed by clean water. So, you know, we've been doing this 25 years now, but we haven't been doing, for water quality, we've been doing 25 years. But we haven't been doing sewering for that long.
Right.
You know, we started the sewer project in really 2010, 2012 is when we first did the first initial phase. Now remember, Chatham had a sewer system all the way back in 1969, 1970.
Right, it's 1960s.
But it was a very limited area, primarily the downtown. And it was built not for water quality reasons, it was primarily built because of the high density downtown, a lot of restaurants and things like that. And you know, septic systems just didn't work well there because lots were very small, and if you wanted to put a restaurant in, you needed a big septic system. So that area has been there for years, but we haven't expanded. We started expanding the system in 2010. So, you know, we're just now coming up kind of on the first 10 years. But the other part that you have to remember is, just because we put sewers down the street doesn't mean that everybody immediately connects to that new sewer line. People have 2 years from the time the Board of Health sends them an order to connect. So, you know, that's another period of time. And then, you know, right now, the last couple of years, contractors have been extremely busy, engineers have been extremely busy. So there's been a lot of extensions to the 2-year time period because people were not able to do it any faster. And unfortunately, you know, it's probably not getting better in that vein because, you know, when we started, Chatham was the only town that was really doing sewers. Now there's multiple towns on the Cape. We don't have any new contractors, we don't have new engineers, everybody is just straight out. So people have to understand that just because you put sewer down a street, it may be years or a decade or more before that improved water quality reaches an estuary.
That's really important to know.
Yeah.
And let's talk about the sewering and what are your thoughts? I mean, this was a huge project. You convinced the town that it needed to be done. You were ahead of the game. And what do you think about what's been done up to this point?
I think Chatham has done exactly what it needed to do, exactly what we laid out when we put the plan together. When the plan was finalized in 2009, we started an implementation right away. Chatham has continued that implementation. You know, there's been some fits and starts with COVID and things. Things were a little bit delayed during that, but we were even doing sewer construction through COVID. So everything didn't stop. So, you know, I think Chatham has been doing what it said it was going to do and what it needs to do. You know, the state came out with new regulations last year that's caught a lot of the other towns kind of behind the 8 ball because they weren't moving as quickly or as effectively as Chatham was. So I think Chatham's in pretty good position. And I think, you know, it's just a question of continue. When we first set it up, it was a 30-year plan. You know, we started in 2010, so we're, you know, 10, 12 years into it. Yeah. So it's just a question of keeping that momentum going to finalize what we said we were going to do and, you know, what the town has been supporting ever since.
So 50 years from now, very likely you're going to be seeing some of these improvements in water quality.
In some of the water bodies, it may be sooner because the watersheds are relatively small. You know, places like Taylor's Pond and some of the others that aren't as big. You know, the Stage Harbor complex, Oyster Pond, Stage Harbor, Mill Pond, that's a big watershed, you know. And so that's going to take time to sewer all that and in time for all that water to move to the point where you get clean water coming in instead of dirty water.
Thank you, Bob. It's kind of amazing where you've been and that you're here to give us this talk today. But we've got to talk to Greg next. He's taken over the position. And I think I have a few questions for you. One is, do you think that the town is doing enough to assure that our waterways continue to improve, or at least don't get worse?
Well, I do think Chatham is ahead of the game for pretty much all the other towns on Cape Cod. There's always room for improvement, but it's kind of a line of, how fast can we move on the plan? And like Bob has said, we're limited somewhat by the pace of contractors and engineers. Right. So I do think we've done pretty much all we can so far. That doesn't mean we're not going to look into the future and look for other ways to adapt and change. And if new technologies come out, we may adapt along those lines. But for now, sticking with the original plan should get us where we need to be.
So the baton has been handed off to you, and you're moving along with it. That's great. What are the main issues at this point that you worry about the future of our coastal waters? What's coming up? I think all of us kind of know that we're going to have a problem with climate change, but what do you see in your crystal ball?
Crystal ball's still a little murky, but so you mentioned climate change. Obviously, that's a big concern in everybody's mind. How fast is it going to be changing? We have temperature changes in addition to sea level rise. As things are getting warmer up here, eutrophication may get worse as that temperature increases. So we're going to be seeing improved water quality when the groundwater finally, gets clean and starts reaching these areas. But what kind of enhanced damage are we going to see due to the warmer temperatures before that happens? So taking a look to see how those various vegetation types are going to be affected by that, and then the overall sea level rise. We have some vegetation types like eelgrass that, they're very dependent on tidal elevations. Same thing with marshes, that those actually need to migrate to upland areas. So as you increase water level, you may be reducing the amount of marsh available, which is going to reduce water quality. So that just, goes to show that we really need to do everything we can on a local level to adapt. So, cleaning the water as it gets to the water body, because it's going to be warmer, there's probably be less vegetation in the future. To try to make up for that, we need to at least clean what we can.
So that's interesting. So Bob's talking about sewering and the watershed contributing this nitrogen, but as you get runoff, you're sending it through those marshes, and those marshes are really important to basically trap particles, to remove the nitrogen before it hits the open water. Is that
right?
What
those
saying?
Marshes are an excellent filtering system between the sediments, some of the nutrients. They use that to grow. And if there's less marshes, you're going to have less filtering before it gets to the coastal water body.
Got it. So what are some of your top projects that are going to protect our waterways? Tell us about the marshes.
Yeah, so marshes, we've talked about the sewering. And that's really the elephant in the room. That's the major project that Chatham is doing to try to, affect the water quality in all of Chatham. On more local levels, we're taking a look at the marshes along the South Shore right now. We've worked with Pleasant Bay to look at the marshes in that system, really to assess their vulnerability and see what kind of adaptation methods we might be able to use to either monitor them or extend their usable viability going into the future. So we are taking a look at our marshes in the context of changing temperatures, sea level rise, and water quality.
So protecting those marshes seems like a huge, huge piece of protecting water quality, along with protecting us from stormwater and sea level rise. They're really, they're on the edge of that. So let's see, let's talk about the water quality data. We've got 25 years of water quality data. There's graphs and some explanation that's going to be going up on a website soon. You want to talk about that? Can people request that data if they want to actually see the spreadsheets?
Sure. Well, this is the town of Chatham's data. This is your data. So, I mean, it is publicly accessible. Before now, you would have had to contact us to get the data, but now it's going to be live on our website. So you can just go to that website and see the graphs as they're related to the location. If you want some of the underlying data behind it, we can certainly share that too. But it should be a decent story looking at these areas over time. I mean, some are going to really, you know, you're looking at a 25-year trend, and this is mostly before the impacts of sewering. So some things have happened, like there might be more tidal flushing due to a certain project. You might be able to see that in the data.
Like Muddy Creek.
Good example. And so, I mean, that's kind of a proxy for how we're hoping when our improved water quality in the groundwater actually gets to these water bodies. Hopefully we'll see something similar, not necessarily maybe as dramatic as, you know, opening a tidal restriction, but something where we start seeing improvement. And that's really why this, you know, water quality monitoring is so important, and having such a long trend of it over time is to say this isn't just a short scale variation, this is actually improvement, and this is, you know, what our various projects, sewering, stormwater projects are leading towards.
So what I see is this, it's really important to have these engaged citizens that are doing this work, and it's really quite amazing what you and they have put together, and what we have to share and what we can utilize for the time going forward. So any final comments?
No, just to reiterate what you said, this would not have been possible without the volunteers.
Yeah.
We've had a great set of volunteers over the years. You know, they come in every year, they go through the training, the refresher training, they take great care of their equipment. You know, we've had some equipment now going on 20 years, and it just shows that if properly taken care of by people that know how to use it, it lasts forever. But yeah, the volunteers have really made the difference in the program.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I thank you so much. The town of Chatham is quite fortunate to have the expertise of these two amazing scientists. And thanks for your time. And me. Thank you for your time, you guys.
Okay, I'm Dick Hosmer. I guess retiree in Chatham. Been here all my life, basically, at least summers. So I'm very familiar with the area. It's a beautiful place, and here we are trying to protect the water, or at least determine what we need to do to keep the water clean and in both the estuaries and ponds, etc.
All right, so here Mr. Hosmer is using a Secchi disc, which is a round circle, black and white, and we use to measure the transparency of the water. Because obviously for things like eelgrass, you need fairly clear water because it is a vascular plant and it requires sunlight in order to grow. And so by using the Secchi disc, we can get an idea of how clear the water is and how much other phytoplankton or other plant material or sediment might be suspended in the water column, making it harder for sun to get through. Here Dick is preparing his water bottles for sample collection, making sure they're properly labeled, as well as getting his refractometer, which is an instrument, a fairly simple one that we use for measuring salinity. And you can see he puts a small sample on top of the instrument. You hold it up to the sun so you get some light through it, and by that you can actually read the salinity of the water. And here he is, he's going to collect the water with a little stopper and put a couple of drops of that actual estuary water on his refractometer, and then he'll be able to tell what the salinity of that water is, compared to something like distilled or deionized water, which has zero salinity, and we use that to check the instrument. That way we know it's accurately portraying what the salinity is in the actual water sample. And obviously easier to do on nice, bright, sunny days than it is on days that are overcast when there isn't as much sun. And now Dick is getting his dissolved oxygen meter ready. We use those to measure the dissolved oxygen and the temperature of the water. That instrument has both capabilities. There are more sophisticated instruments out there that can measure many other water quality parameters, but we're primarily interested in dissolved oxygen and temperature. And depending on the depth of the water, we will take these measurements at generally 2 different places. a meter off the bottom and then a ½ meter below the surface. But as you could tell, Dick's station is so shallow that he can simply walk in. And so there we only take one measurement at roughly a mid-depth. And he moves that probe up and down to make sure we have clear water against the probe at all times to take an accurate measurement. And as you can tell, it's not dependent on how clear the water is. Dissolved oxygen doesn't matter whether it's clear or cloudy water. We're just looking to see what that is because dissolved oxygen is so important to the organisms, the fish and the shellfish and other critters that live in the water. If dissolved oxygen gets too low, those critters can either move like fish can, or if there's something like a shellfish, they may die because the dissolved oxygen level gets too low. And so there Dick is just moving his instrument around. You have to let it stabilize as much as you can. These are natural conditions and things are not absolute. So it may take a few minutes to get to a reading that's pretty consistent. And so Dick knows that that's the reading that he wants to record on his data sheet. And there's Mr. Hosmer recording his data on the data sheet. One of the important things that he records, in addition to the conditions in the environment, is also the condition of the meter when he first calibrated it. That way we know the instrument is functionally okay and is ready to go and get accurate measurements, and that's part of our agreement with EPA and DEP and others that use this data. And now Dick is filling his bottles, one of his bottles with water, where we then send those samples down to UMass Dartmouth to take analyses for things like chlorophyll and nitrogen and some of the various breakdown products of total nitrogen. And you can see he's filling two different bottles. One is a light bottle and one is a dark brown bottle. Because the dark brown one, there's obviously some phytoplankton and all in this water when we collect these samples. And so by putting the water in a dark bottle away from sunlight, it basically stops phytoplankton from doing their thing, and we will get a water sample that's representative, even though it may not get to the lab for a couple of hours. That water sample will still be representative of the water quality at the time of collection. And now Mr. Hosmer is getting ready to filter some of the water sample through a special filter because we take two different measurements, or a couple different measurements. But one of the measurements we take is dissolved nutrients, so those that are dissolved in the water column. And we also take measurements of particulate nutrients, those that are connected to the particulate matter, like the phytoplankton that's in the water sample.